Raymond had a system. It had taken him decades to perfect, and if you were watching closely at any family dinner, you could see him running it in real time. The slight lean forward when voices started to climb. The redirect into a story nobody asked for, but that everyone half listened to anyway. The joke deployed at exactly the right moment. Not funny enough to be insulting, just funny enough to give people a place to put their faces that wasn't each other. He'd been doing it so long it had stopped feeling like effort. That was the dangerous part. Things that stop feeling like effort don't disappear. They just go underground, and you stop noticing the cost, until one day you reach for the usual reserves and find the tank empty, and yourself still at the table, with two people you love who are looking past each other and waiting for you to build the bridge again. That was the Sunday in October. The one where Raymond did something he had never done in 47 years of being a father. He pushed his chair back from the table, set his napkin beside his plate, and stood up. Both of his children looked at him. The argument stopped the way arguments stop when the ground shifts. Mid-sentence, mid-point, the air suddenly changed. "I love you both," he said. "I mean that." And then he walked to the back door and out into the yard and left them sitting there. He stood on the patio for a long time. The afternoon light was already going amber, cutting low through the neighbor's oak tree. He could hear, very faintly through the glass door behind him, the absence of sound where the fighting had been. Neither of them talking. Neither of them walking out. He exhaled. He hadn't planned it. He still wasn't entirely sure he'd done the right thing. But something in him, some piece he hadn't been in contact with in a long time, felt something close to solid. If a story like this one makes you stop and think about someone in your own life, someone who's been holding things together without anyone asking if they're okay, subscribe to the channel. We look at real human situations here, without the noise. Raymond Kowalski had been born in Cleveland, raised in a house where you didn't make your problems visible because visible problems made your mother worry and your father feel like he'd failed. He'd carried that forward in the way you carry things you learn before you have language for them. Not as a philosophy, but as a reflex. Keep the temperature down. Find the middle ground. Make it easier for everyone to stay in the room. He was 72 now. He'd worked 30 years in facilities management for a school district, the kind of job that requires you to solve problems before other people realize they have them, and he'd been good at it. And now he was retired and lived in the same house in Westerville, Ohio, where he'd raised his family. A 4-bedroom colonial with aluminum siding he kept meaning to have replaced, and a backyard that was his actual domain. The place where he grew tomatoes in summer and thought his real thoughts. His wife Ellen had died 6 years ago. Breast cancer, 2 years from diagnosis to the end. It had been the hardest thing that had ever happened to him, and he'd managed it the way he managed everything. By holding himself steady while the people around him came apart and then came back together, and by saving his own falling apart for the early mornings when no one could see it. After Ellen, the weight of keeping the family together had shifted entirely onto him. She had been the one who called, who remembered, who knew which kid was struggling and why. He'd been the backup, the presence, the grill, the laugh, "Your mother told me." After she was gone, there was no backup. There was just Raymond and the phone in his hand, and the knowledge that if he didn't make the call, weeks might pass. He knew his children. He knew them the way you know people you've loved imperfectly and specifically for their entire lives. Greg was 47, the older one, a project manager at a construction firm in Columbus. He was precise and had strong opinions about correct processes, which made him excellent at his work and exhausting in an argument because he treated every disagreement like a scope of work problem that needed a documented solution. He'd been like that since he was 12. Opinionated, convinced, genuinely, completely sure of himself in a way that Raymond had sometimes envied and more often found something to manage. Diane was 44, a speech therapist in private practice, lived 40 minutes away in Dublin. She was warm, she was perceptive, she remembered the kinds of details that made other people feel seen. She was also, in conflict, capable of something that moved slowly, like water finding the lowest point. A hurt that didn't present as hurt, that came out instead as a cutting precision, a perfect recall of every evidence that confirmed what she already felt. She knew how to make a fact sound like a verdict. The two of them had been circling a version of the same argument for years. Since their mother's death, if Raymond was honest with himself, though the roots of it were older than that. It was about the estate, or rather, it had started there. The handling of Ellen's jewelry, the decision about the house, who had done more, who had been consulted, who had not. In the 6 years since, the original grievance had composted into something richer and more complex, feeding on every new occasion where one of them felt overlooked or unacknowledged or unfairly burdened. The specific subject of the argument changed. The argument itself did not. Raymond had, over those 6 years, successfully diverted it approximately 30 times. He'd kept count without meaning to. The system worked like this. You watch for the first sign, usually a tone, a word choice, a silence that's too pointed. You move quickly. Story, question, joke, offer of food or drink, sudden memory of a thing you need to show someone, mild complaint about your own week that resets the conversational temperature. The goal is to get everyone out of the elevated state and back into the ordinary one before anything is said that becomes load-bearing, before someone stakes a position that requires defense. It worked because his children were not actually interested in destroying each other. They were interested in being right, and in feeling it acknowledged, and in not having to be the person who reached first. Raymond had understood this for a long time. The problem, the thing he was slower to name, was that by consistently removing the need for them to reach, he had also removed their practice at it. And people who don't practice reaching tend, over time, to stop believing they know how. He understood this clearly on the Sunday in October. He had not understood it 6 years before at the first Thanksgiving without Ellen, when Greg made a comment about how the jewelry distribution had been handled, and Diane's voice went very quiet. And Raymond had made a long story about a thing that had happened at the school district in 2007. A story he told with enough warmth and apparent relevance that by the end of it, everyone was past the moment and somewhere else. He'd felt then like he'd done something good. He had done something. He wasn't sure anymore that it was good. The October gathering had not been planned as anything significant. Diane had mentioned a few weeks before that she'd been thinking about a Sunday dinner, nothing holiday-related, just a real dinner, a reason to cook something that required more than one pot. She missed the rhythm of it, she said. Raymond said he'd come. Greg, reached separately, said he'd come too. Diane's husband Tom was traveling for work. Greg's wife Karen was there. The plan was simple. Raymond would arrive at 2, there would be a late lunch or early dinner. It would be the way it was supposed to be. He drove over with a pie. He almost always brought something, not because it was expected, but because the act of bringing something was part of how he moved through the world. It announced that he'd thought about you before he arrived. He'd bought it from the bakery Diane had mentioned liking, a place near his dentist, and he'd remembered the flavor she'd said she liked best without writing it down. He arrived to the sound of nothing alarming. Greg and Karen's car was in the driveway. Music from the kitchen. He knocked and let himself in. The kitchen smelled good. Diane had made a pot roast, and the smell of it, that particular slow-cooked root vegetable smell, moved through the house like something deliberate. She was at the counter, slightly flushed from cooking, and she turned and said, "Dad," in the warm voice she had for him. And he set the pie on the counter, and she said, "Hazelnut. Perfect. You remembered." Greg was in the living room with Karen, looking at his phone. He stood when Raymond came in, and they did the shoulder-pat handshake they'd been doing since Greg was in his 30s. The handshake Raymond had let replace the hug when Greg decided he was a handshake person. which Raymond had accepted without comment. Karen hugged him properly. She was the warmer of the two, and she'd always made Ray feel like someone's favorite guest. The first hour was comfortable. Raymond sat at the kitchen island and kept Diane company while she finished cooking. Greg came through at intervals, refilling his drink, making comments about the pot roast that managed to be appreciative and slightly instructional at the same time. "Smells like it's almost there, yeah," which Diane received with the particular focused silence of someone choosing not to respond. Raymond noticed the silence. He filed it. They moved to the table. The food was good. The wine helped. For a while, the conversation moved easily. Karen's job, Raymond's tomato yield this past summer, a trip Greg and Karen were considering for the spring. Diane asked about the tomatoes in detail, and Raymond was happy to talk about them. He'd grown 11 varieties this year, an experiment he'd started the summer after Ellen died, when he needed something to do in the mornings that wasn't being in the house. Partway through the meal, Greg refilled his own glass and mentioned the house. Not directly. He mentioned it sideways, the way the subject always entered, through something adjacent. He was talking about a neighbor of his who was dealing with an estate situation, complicated, multiple siblings, none of them agreeing on timeline. "Classic problem," Greg said. "No one puts anything in writing. Everyone just assumes the other person will be reasonable." He said it in the tone of someone who was describing a situation that is emphatically not about himself. Diane looked at her plate. Raymond saw it. The small stillness that moved through her. The half-second recalibration of her posture. He started to say something about his neighbor Gary's estate situation, which was indeed a story. He'd told it before, or something like it. He had it ready. But he didn't say it. He wasn't sure afterward why he stopped. Some small thing, some tiredness. Not a dramatic tiredness, just the ordinary kind. The way a muscle doesn't give out but simply doesn't fire with the usual speed. He opened his mouth and then didn't speak, and took a sip of wine instead. Diane said, "That's interesting, Greg, given that some people benefit from things not being in writing." Greg looked at her. "I'm sorry," he said. "The jewelry," she said, "just as a general example." Karen picked up her fork and looked at the window. Raymond sat. He watched it unfold the way it always unfolded, but this time without the intercept, and something about seeing it without the intercept made it look different than it had before. It was the same film he'd seen 30 times, except this time he could see the entire frame, and in the frame he could see himself, and what he looked like was a person who had confused keeping peace with making peace, and who had been doing it so long he'd started to believe they were the same. Greg's voice changed registers, less conversational, more structured. He was explaining, in the careful tone of someone who has prepared for this conversation without admitting it, that the decisions made in the months after their mother's death had been made collectively, that Diane had been consulted at every step, that her current claim that she had not been consulted was revisionist in a way that required a particular kind of selective memory. Diane said she had not been consulted, she had been informed. There was a difference, she said. She said it quietly. She had a way of being quiet that took up more room than a raised voice. Greg said that was not how he remembered it. Diane said she had the emails. The air in the room changed the way it changes in that specific family argument way. Not loud, not dramatic, but pressurized, like something had been sealed in without enough room. Karen excused herself to get water from the kitchen. She came back with water, but also stood near the door for a moment, her hand on the back of her chair. Greg looked at Raymond. It was a reflex, the look he'd had since boyhood, the one that said, "You see this, right? Tell her. You always know the right thing to say." Diane looked at Raymond, too. Hers said something different. Hers said, "He's doing it again. You can see he's doing it again." Raymond looked back at both of them. He was very familiar with this position. The exact geometry of it, sun on one side, daughter on the other, himself in the middle, everyone waiting for him to perform the function, to translate, to locate the reasonable position that allowed everyone to exit the moment without having to do the hard work of arriving there themselves. He'd been the person in this position for long enough that he wasn't sure they remembered he was a person and not a position. He thought about something he'd seen an hour before. Earlier in the afternoon, Diane's oldest, who was in his 20s and had dropped by briefly before heading to a friend's place, had been talking to Greg's daughter, also an adult, mid-20s, and something low-grade had developed between them, some small tonal shift that Raymond had clocked from across the room. Nothing serious, just the beginning of a posture, a specific kind of tightening. And what he'd noticed was that the young woman had looked toward the kitchen, toward the adults, with an expression Raymond recognized. The expression of someone waiting for someone else to come in and smooth it down. She'd learned that from somewhere. He sat with that recognition for a moment. It sat in him differently than he expected. Greg said, "Dad, can you just tell her what actually happened? With the accountant, you were there." "Greg," Raymond said, "I'm asking you a factual question. I know what you're asking." Diane said, "He doesn't need to be your witness, Greg." "I'm not asking him to be a witness. I'm asking him to remember what actually—" "Dad." Diane's voice. Not loud, just pointed, aimed at him. "Can you please explain to him why that decision affected me differently? You understood that at the time. You said you understood." They were both looking at him. Raymond put his hands flat on the table. He felt the wood under his palms, warm, solid. He looked at his plate for a moment. He looked at his wine glass. He looked at the pie he'd driven to the bakery to buy because Diane had mentioned, months ago, that hazelnut was her favorite, and he'd held on to that information like it was something worth carrying. He looked at Greg, the tight set of his shoulders, the performance of reasonable patience over real frustration, the look of a man who had rehearsed being the wronged party often enough that it had stopped feeling like a performance. He looked at Diane, the stillness, the precision, the beautiful, controlled articulation of someone who has learned to make hurt invisible by making it irrefutable. He thought about Ellen. He thought about how she'd seen both of these things in both of them long before Raymond had, and how she'd handled it differently than he had. Not by deflecting, but by saying directly, "Diane, you're doing the thing," or "Greg, let it go tonight." And how both of them had listened to her in a way they'd never quite listened to him. And how, after she was gone, Raymond had decided that someone had to fill the space, and had assumed that someone was him, and had never asked whether the approach he was using was doing what he thought it was doing. He thought about the last 6 years, and all the dinners, and all the redirected conversations, and all the stories he'd told to buy everyone 30 seconds of reset. And he thought, they are 44 and 47 years old. He pushed his chair back. The sound of it, the legs on hardwood, short and final, stopped both of them mid-thought. He picked up his napkin and set it on the table beside his plate. He stood. They were both looking at him. Diane's expression, uncertain. Greg's, confused, then something sharper. "I love you both," Raymond said. "I mean that." He walked to the back door. He opened it and stepped out into the October yard and pulled the door closed behind him. The yard was still. Diane kept it better than the house in some ways. The garden beds edged, the lawn holding on through the autumn. The neighbor's oak was going gold and dropping, and a few leaves had gathered in the corner by the fence in the way leaves always gathered, despite anything you did about it. Raymond walked to the middle of the yard and stood there. He did not feel righteous. He wanted to name that clearly, even to himself. There was nothing triumphant about what he'd just done. His chest felt strange. His hands were not quite steady. He pressed them together and stood in the amber afternoon light and listened to the yard. Through the glass of the back door, he could hear nothing. That was what he was listening for. What they were doing in there without him. If they were doing anything. A long moment passed. No sound of chairs. No footsteps. No voices. He walked to the patio chairs and sat down. He hadn't brought his jacket, and it was cool, mid-50s. The particular outdoor cold of early Ohio October that settles quickly once you stop moving. He didn't go back for the jacket. He sat for a long time. He thought about his father, a quiet man from Akron who had not spoken much, but who had kept opinions he never shared. Raymond had sometimes wondered, in the way you wonder about the dead without expecting answers, whether his father had been silent by temperament or by training, whether holding things back had been his character or his inheritance. Raymond had at least been warm, had at least been present, had at least stayed in the room. He'd told himself for years that staying in the room was what mattered, but he was thinking now that there were different ways to be in a room, and that he'd been there physically, reliably, always, but that he'd also been operating a very specific function, the function of preventing discomfort, and that the function had cost him something he hadn't been accounting for, and that the people he'd been running the function for had gotten very used to it, had come to count on it, had in fact oriented their behavior around its availability in a way that made its absence difficult. He was thinking about what his absence from that table was doing right now. He didn't know. That was the thing that made his hands unsteady. He didn't know. He'd never not known before. He'd always been able to predict the family weather, read the signs, intervene early enough to control the outcome. And now he'd removed himself from the system, and the system was running without him, and he didn't know what it was doing. He sat in the cold and did not go back inside. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in his position? Sometimes the clearest view is from the outside, and sometimes you need to hear what someone else is carrying before you can name the weight in your own house. He heard the back door open after about 20 minutes. Footsteps. Diane, from the sound, the particular rhythm of her walking, which she'd known her whole life. She came across the patio and stopped beside him and looked at him for a moment, and then sat down in the other chair. She didn't say anything for a while. Neither did he. "Greg and Karen left," she said eventually. "Okay." Another silence. The neighbor's oak shed a slow rotation of leaves, one at a time. "He said he'll call you this week," Diane said. Raymond nodded once. "Dad." She shifted in the chair, pulled her cardigan tighter. "Why did you do that?" He thought about how to answer it. He turned the question over and looked at the different ways he could approach it. The gentle version, the deflecting version, the "I just needed some air" version. He'd been managing this particular daughter for 44 years. He knew how to make something easier for her to hear. He told her the truth instead. "I've been the one calling first for 6 years. He said. "I've been the one arranging for you to be in the same room. I've been the one finding something to say when you two start in on each other. And I don't know if that helped you or if it just meant you never had to practice being different." She was quiet for a moment. "That's a lot to put on us." "I know it is. We never asked you to manage us." "I know that too," he said. "You didn't ask. I just volunteered myself into a position and then kept it for 30 years. And now I'm tired. And I don't know if that's your fault or mine. Maybe it's neither. But I'm tired." Diane looked at the yard. A muscle in her jaw moved. "Did you ever say any of this to Mom?" she said. "No." "Why not?" He considered this. He hadn't thought about the why not before. Not directly. "Because I thought it was my job," he said. "And you don't complain about your job to the people whose life it's making easier?" Diane was quiet for a long time after that, long enough that Raymond stopped waiting for a response and just sat with the view of the yard, the cold, the neighbor's oak, the slow accumulation of October. "I didn't know," she said finally, "that it took that much." "I know you didn't," he said. "That's part of what I'm telling you." Greg called on Wednesday. Raymond let it ring through the first time, not on purpose. He was in the garden, and saw the missed call and called back that evening from his kitchen with a glass of water on the counter that he'd poured and forgotten to drink. Greg answered on the second ring. "Hey, Dad." "Hey." A pause. The particular compressed silence of a person who has things to say and is deciding on sequence. "I wanted to call Sunday," Greg said. "I wasn't sure. I figured you needed a little space." "I was in the yard," Raymond said. "I wasn't far." "Right." Another pause. "Is everything okay?" "You're okay?" "I'm fine," Raymond said. He meant it. He felt, actually, fine. A little empty in a way that didn't feel bad, just new. "I wanted to say something the other day and I didn't do it very gracefully. You and your sister have been fighting the same fight for 6 years and I've been the one who interrupts it, every time. And I think I should stop." Greg was quiet. "Not because I'm angry," Raymond said. "I'm not angry. I just think I've been doing you a disservice. Both of you." "Dad, the thing with the estate—" "I know what the thing with the estate is, Greg. I was there. I know what each of you remembers, and I know where the two memories don't match, and I'm not going to tell you who's right." He said it evenly, without heat. "You two are going to have to figure that out, without me as the judge." Greg said nothing for a moment. "That's okay," he said slowly. "I get that. He stopped. Tried again. "I feel like every time I try to have a reasonable conversation with Diane, she turns it into a referendum on who Mom loved more, and that's—" His voice changed slightly, tightened. "That's not what I want to do. I don't want to have that conversation, but she keeps finding the way back to it." Raymond sat with that. He turned it over. He heard the truth in it. He also heard all the things Greg was not examining about himself, the way he'd framed the October dinner as an abstract example before anything else had been said, the calculated remove of it. But he didn't say that. He just listened. "I know," Raymond said. "She's carrying something from those months. I don't think you mean to dismiss it. I don't think she means to make it a referendum. But you two need to be the ones in the room having that conversation, not me in the middle of it." "She won't," Greg said. "She doesn't want to." "Maybe she will now," Raymond said. A long pause. "What happened to her?" Greg said. "In your mind, what actually happened that made her—" He stopped again. Started differently. "Is she right? About not being consulted?" Raymond picked up the glass of water. He held it. He set it down. "She felt like she wasn't," he said. "And that's where you need to start, not with who's correct, with why she felt that way." "That's not an answer." "I know," Raymond said. "Call your sister." He did not know if Greg called Diane. He didn't ask. 3 weeks passed. He went about his life in the way he'd been going about his life. The garden, the Wednesday coffee with an old coworker from the district, a movie he saw alone at the theater on a Thursday afternoon because he liked having the option and the afternoon crowd was always small. He called Greg twice about non-family things. Once about a car noise Greg had mentioned wanting a second opinion on. Once because Raymond had found something in the garage that he thought Greg would want. He called Diane once to ask about a bread recipe she'd mentioned. No one mentioned October. He didn't know what to do with the silence. He'd expected something, some outcome, some indication that the machine had processed the change and arrived at a new state. But the family didn't work like that. It worked the way weather worked, the way plants worked. Slowly, below the surface, with long delays between cause and visible effect. He knew this from experience. He still found the silence uncomfortable. He talked to his friend Dennis about it. Dennis was 70, retired teacher, divorced 20 years ago, had 3 kids in 3 different cities who called with varying frequency. He was someone Raymond could be honest with, which was a rare thing. "You stopped doing the thing," Dennis said. They were at Dennis's kitchen table with bad coffee that Raymond drank without complaint because he was a guest. "And now you're waiting for them to notice." "I'm not waiting for anything," Raymond said. Dennis looked at him. "Maybe I'm waiting for them to be okay," Raymond said. "Are they not okay?" "I don't know. That's the problem. I always knew. I always had a read on where they were and what they needed, and He stopped, turned his coffee mug. "I feel like I gave up the one thing that made me useful." Dennis thought about this. "You weren't useful, Ray. You were indispensable. There's a difference." Raymond looked at him. "Useful is something you do because it helps," Dennis said. "Indispensable is something you become because everyone's built around you being there. When you're useful, people manage when you're gone. When you're indispensable, everyone panics." He shrugged. "Your kids aren't panicking, so maybe they're managing." Raymond thought about that for a few days. He wasn't sure it made him feel better or worse. The thing that he kept coming back to, the image that had been the actual turning point, though he hadn't named it at the time, was the look on Greg's daughter's face. The look across the room, the scanning for an adult to smooth the surface. She was 26. She had been doing that her whole life. She'd been doing it because she'd grown up in a family where that was the process. Something tenses, someone intervenes, everything resets. Nobody has to sit in the discomfort long enough to push through it. He thought about what she would do when she was 44 and something tense with the people she loved, and there was no one in the room performing that function. He thought about what his children would do. He thought about Ellen, who had always insisted that the kids resolve things directly, who had been firm about it in the way she was firm about the important things. Quiet, unmovable, patient without being passive. He'd thought, when she was alive, that he was backing her up. He understood now that he'd been undercutting her. Every time he'd smoothed something over, he'd offered an easier route around the friction she was trying to make them sit with. He'd meant well. That was the part that was the hardest to hold. He'd meant every bit of it. He'd done all of it out of love, the real kind, not the performing kind, not the kind that wants credit. He had genuinely wanted his family to stay together and feel good and not carry damage from the times they'd scraped against each other. He'd wanted that so much that he'd sacrificed their practice of enduring each other for the good feeling of the moment. And the moment had accumulated, over 30 years, into a family where 2 grown adults looked at their 72-year-old father and waited for him to manage their discomfort. He sat with that for a long time. He didn't feel sorry for himself. He wasn't built for that. Or maybe he'd just had too much practice accepting what was. But he felt the weight of it. The specific weight of understanding something fully too late to have done it differently, when the different version of it would have required being a different person at 35 or 45 than the person he'd been. He was not that person. He'd been this one, and this one had done what he knew how to do. Thanksgiving was 6 weeks after October. He'd half expected one or both of them to find a reason not to come. An excuse, travel, a friend's holiday, a calendar conflict that materialized out of nowhere the way they do when people want to avoid something. He'd been prepared for it. He'd decided, quietly, that if that happened, he would not be the one to close the gap. He would call, he would say he'd missed them, he would not arrange a makeup date. He would let them find their way back on their own clock. But they both came. Diane hosted again. Greg and Karen arrived before Raymond, which was unusual. Greg was a prompt person by nature, But he'd also, Raymond suspected, come early enough to help set up, which was a gesture he didn't usually make. Raymond arrived at 1 o'clock and came through the door and found the three of them in the kitchen, Greg and Diane and Karen, doing the comfortable work of an almost ready meal, the kind of logistics that require people to move around each other, hand things off, find the drawer with the right serving spoon. There was something about it that was different from October. Quieter, maybe. More deliberate. Not the ease of people who have resolved something, but the ease of people who have chosen to be in the room. They ate early, around 3, the 4 of them at the table. Tom was traveling again. It was a small Thanksgiving. The conversation moved through the usual territory: work, the news, Raymond's winter plans for the garden, whether the pie was from the same bakery as last time. It moved without his directing it. There were pauses, natural ones, the kind that don't need to be filled. He let them breathe. Near the end of the meal, Greg said something about the accountant, not the old one, not in the contested past, but a new one he'd found for his own business, who he thought Raymond might want for his tax situation. He said it without subtext, just information. Diane said it sounded useful. She asked a practical question about fees. They talked about the accountant for 3 minutes, straightforwardly, like people who were not trying to make a point. Raymond served himself more stuffing. He didn't look up. He didn't intervene. He didn't redirect. After dinner, while Karen and Diane dealt with the kitchen and Greg had disappeared into what Raymond assumed was his phone, Raymond sat alone at the table for a few minutes with his coffee. The table had the aftermath of Thanksgiving look. Napkins, wine glasses with rings, the serving dishes pushed toward the middle. He sat in the comfortable wreckage of it. Greg came back and sat across from him. He put his phone face down on the table. He folded his hands. He looked at Raymond. "I called her," he said. Raymond waited. "Diane. After you. After October." He picked up his water glass and put it down. "We talked for a while. It was..." He paused. "Not great, but also not as bad as it's been at the table. She said some things I needed to hear. I said some things she said she needed to hear." He exhaled. "I don't know if we fixed anything. I don't think we fixed it. But we talked." Raymond nodded. Greg looked at his hands. "She said you told her it cost you, keeping us from each other's throats." "I didn't say it quite like that," Raymond said. "That was the gist?" "Something like that." Greg was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know," he said. It wasn't a defense. It was just a fact, stated plainly, with the specific inflection of someone saying something they can't unsay and aren't trying to explain. "I know you didn't," Raymond said. Greg looked up. He had his mother's eyes, a specific shade of gray-blue that Raymond still found startling sometimes at unexpected moments. Are you okay? I mean genuinely, not fine. Are you okay?" Raymond looked at him. He thought about the question, the real version of it, not the version that required a polished answer. "I'm getting there," he said. Greg nodded. He picked up his phone and put it in his pocket, which Raymond recognized as a gesture of staying present. "Okay," he said. "Good." They sat together for a few minutes. The kitchen sounds from down the hall, dishes, voices, something falling, and then laughter. In December, Raymond drove out to visit his older sister in Akron. She was 79 and still sharp and entirely unbothered by the fact that she hadn't been to Columbus since 2019. He drove the hour and a half because she didn't like highways anymore and because he didn't mind driving. They sat in her living room. She made coffee with the old percolator she'd had since the 80s and that still made coffee better than most modern things. And they talked without hurry, the way people talk when they've known each other long enough that the silences are part of the conversation. He told her about October. She listened without interrupting, which was one of her gifts. She'd always let you say the whole thing before she said anything back. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You know what Pop used to say?" she said. He didn't. He used to say, "You can want peace or you can have it. You can't want it enough for two people." She shook her head. He never practiced what he preached, mind you. He'd go quiet for weeks when he was unhappy with something. But he said it. Raymond thought about his father, the quiet man. The man whose silences he'd spent his whole childhood trying to interpret, and whose death had left Raymond with a persistent feeling of something unfinished, something he hadn't quite managed to say in time. "Did he ever," Raymond started, "did you ever feel like he was holding it together? For all of you?" His sister looked at him with the specific expression she'd had since childhood, the one that meant, "You already know this answer." "He held it together for Mom," she said. "And Mom held it together for us. And we held it together for you because you were the youngest." She shrugged. "That's just what families do, until someone decides not to anymore." "Do you think that was wrong?" Raymond said. "The holding together." She thought about this. "I think it was kind," she said finally. "And I think it was also a little cowardly. Both things." She looked at him. "For him, not for you. You held it together a long time, Raymond. Longer than you needed to." He drove home in the dusk. The highway back to Columbus was straight and flat and familiar. He let the car do the work and thought about what she'd said. Kind and cowardly, both things, not one or the other. And it fit in a way he hadn't expected. It fit because it made room for him to have been both right and wrong at the same time, without either canceling the other out. He didn't need to decide which he'd been more of. He was still his father's son in some ways, and his own person in others. And the October afternoon, and the cold yard, and the door left closed behind him felt, on this drive, less like a failure, and more like something he'd simply been a long time arriving at. A thing he'd had to earn through all the years he'd spent doing it differently. He got home at 7. He made toast because he wasn't hungry for anything real. He sat at his kitchen table and ate it and read something on his phone, and then set his phone down and sat in the quiet house. He called Diane. No reason, just a call. She picked up. "Hey, Dad, everything okay?" "Everything's fine. I was just thinking about you." He paused. "How are you, actually?" She was quiet for a moment. Not the bad kind of quiet. "I'm okay," she said. "Better this week than last week." A pause. "Greg and I had a conversation." "He told me." "Did he tell you what I said?" "No." "Oh." She sounded slightly surprised. "Well." A small sound he recognized, something that was almost a laugh. "I told him I was sorry for the way I'd been doing it. The way I kept going back to the same thing. I wasn't wrong about what happened, but I've been—" She stopped, started again. "I've been using it as a way to keep him at a distance, I think. It's easier to be right than to be close to someone who hurts you." Raymond said nothing for a moment. "That's a hard thing to see about yourself," he said. "Yeah." A pause. "I had some help." Another pause. Longer. "Thanks for walking out, Dad." He laughed then, a short, surprised sound. "That's not usually how that sentence ends." "No," she said. "Probably not." They talked a while longer. She asked about Thanksgiving cleanup. She'd found one of his serving dishes in her cabinet. He said he'd pick it up next time he was over. She said she'd make something, come for dinner, not just the dish. He said he would. He didn't say soon. He said, "How about the first Saturday in January?" She said that worked. He put it in his calendar when they hung up. He wrote her name in the title. He set a reminder. He wasn't sure any of it was fixed. He'd stopped expecting things to be fixed. That was something that had left him gradually, the expectation of resolution, of the conversation that finally closed the loop. Families didn't close loops. They just kept moving, carrying the same loops along, and what changed was whether the loops got heavier or lighter over time. He'd spent a long time trying to make the loops lighter for his children by carrying them himself, and the loops had not gotten lighter. They just migrated, relocated from where they were visible to where they weren't, and when they surfaced again, they were the same weight they'd always been, just with more years underneath them. He couldn't undo that. He was clear-eyed about the limits of what any of them could undo. What he could do, what he was doing quietly without announcing it, was show up differently. Not as the function, not as the bridge or the translator or the emergency exit from discomfort, just as himself. A 72-year-old man who loved his children and was not available to manage the space between them anymore. It was a small change. From the outside, you might not see it at all. You would see him sitting at the table, same as always, same easy presence, same warmth in the room when he laughed. You'd have to watch for a long time to notice what was different. That when the air thickened, he didn't reach for the story. He just sat. He let it be thick. He trusted that two grown people were capable of deciding what to do with it. Sometimes they were. Sometimes they weren't. He was learning to live in the uncertainty of that. He went to the garden on the first cold morning of December, the first morning where the ground had that frozen quality that meant the season was done. He stood in the row where the tomatoes had been, bare stakes, a few dead runners still wrapped around the wire, and thought about the spring. He'd been thinking about trying a couple of new varieties, something heirloom. He'd read about a place in Pennsylvania that did interesting seeds, and he'd been meaning to order a catalog. He pulled the dead runners off the stakes and coiled them and put them in the compost. He pulled the stakes and stacked them along the fence. He turned the soil in the bed, just the surface, just enough to break the crust, and left it to sit through winter. He went inside and washed his hands and ordered the catalog online because he'd stopped waiting for the perfect moment to do the things he'd been meaning to do. The catalog would take 2 weeks, which meant it would arrive in time for him to read it over the holidays, which was exactly the kind of quiet evening task he'd discovered he was good at. He made coffee. He sat in the kitchen with it. The house was quiet in the way old houses are quiet, not empty, just still. Full of all the years it contained. He'd been in this house for 39 years. He'd carried Ellen home from the hospital in a car older than either of his children. He'd watched both of his kids leave through the front door for the last time, with their things in boxes, and then watched them come back over and over for holidays and disasters and ordinary Sundays. He thought about the ordinary Sundays. How many of them, how unremarkable they'd seemed at the time. He sat in the quiet and drank his coffee while it was still hot, and he didn't reach for the phone, and he didn't turn on the television. He just sat in his house and let it be a quiet Tuesday morning in December, with nothing required of him. It was, he thought, a reasonable way to spend a morning. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think about someone in your own life who's been holding things together quietly, or if you recognized yourself in one of the people at the table, leave a word in the comments. Not an answer, just a thought. Sometimes the most honest things a person says are in response to someone else's story, at a safe distance from their own.